Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It feels like a long time ago that I came before you for jury selection, and we talked about all the factors of this case from the perspective of how do we pick the best jury? How do we pick the people who are going to be able to sit here for 2 weeks, these incredibly important 2 weeks, listen to all this evidence, some of it difficult, and come to the right conclusion. But we're so grateful because y'all have stuck with us this whole 2 weeks. We haven't lost anybody. We haven't lost anybody's attention. Y'all care about doing the right thing in this case. It's evident. And so you already know. You've already heard all of the evidence in this case. And so you already know that the state didn't prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. Because nothing the lawyers say is evidence. All we can do is give our perspective in closing arguments and try to wrap up some things from the past 2 weeks that might provide you some assistance as you go back in that jury room and deliberate. And so I've got half an hour to talk to y'all about that, and I'll try to hit the points that I think are going to be most important. But y'all are the ones who have been hearing the evidence. Y'all are the ones who know if evidence has been brought before you to prove what the state has said. And let's start off with the state saying this is the state versus Matthew and Willard Hernandez, not defacts, not show up. I agree. That is the case. It is the state versus the Hernandez family. However, it is not show up versus the Hernandez family. At no point has Forsyth County delegated law enforcement authority to show up. And that's important because generally in a criminal case, the way it works is that a law enforcement officer will come and testify about what they did in an investigation of what was going on, how they determined the facts that they swore to a judge in a warrant were true, so that a prosecution like this could begin. But who did the investigation in this case? Who did the investigation and was willing to sit up here under oath and look at all of you in the eye and say, yes, I am confident that these people abused their child? No one. The state had not a single witness who could stand up here and say, or sit up here in the witness stand and say, I have reviewed this whole case. I know everything about Emma Hernandez's medical records. I know everything about the circumstances of her family. I know everything about her health conditions as it persisted throughout the multiple foster homes. I know everything about all of the medical appointments that her parents took her to. I know everything about all of that. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, you can be confident that one or both of these people committed heinous acts against their child. No one was willing to do that. The state had no one who could come up here and swear to that. The closest thing they had was some doctors from CHOA, the first one, who made his decision in under 2 hours. He looked at some x-rays, didn't even talk to the other doctors who had already been treating Emma Hernandez after her parents brought her in for help finding out what was going on with her and her health. One doctor came in, interrupted the orthopedic consult that was already in process and that Emma was already being treated for, and had to come in with his, well, we don't know, was it an impression, was it a diagnosis? That didn't seem very important to him on the stand, but he decided that it was non-accidental trauma. And once you have a doctor from CHOA putting that in the record, it's amazing how all the other doctors then find that same thing. Well, not all the other doctors, because the state had a lot of other doctors that they could have brought before you who treated Emma Hernandez. And you have to ask yourself why they chose not to bring any of those doctors before you. In a fracture case, they don't have a single orthopedic resident or doctor or anyone who's an expert in the field of bone fractures to come and talk to you about this. They have to rely on a child abuse pediatrician and one pediatric radiologist who wasn't even involved in the original reading and didn't even write her own report. Ladies and gentlemen, there's something wrong with Emma Hernandez, and one of those things is that there are doctors in there, that case, who forgot their oath to first do no harm. And instead, when they were the hammer of a child abuse pediatrician, everything looked like a nail for them to hammer in. These are not the medical records of a perfectly healthy child. A perfectly healthy child doesn't have to be admitted to CHOA for multiple days, doesn't have to come back barely a month later and stay for another week, and have to have consults with multiple departments at Children's Hospital. There are doctors who knew that something was going on with Emma that needed to be thoroughly investigated, but the state didn't bring any of those doctors before you today, even though they appear in the medical records and provided their impressions of Emma Hernandez's case. So none of these people, even the child abuse pediatrician, were willing to come to you and say, I am confident that these people abused their child. So no one will take responsibility for looking at all of those facts and coming to that conclusion that they are asking you to find beyond a reasonable doubt. If there's no witness from the state who even has the facts and can believe this beyond a reasonable doubt, how on earth did they expect y'all to? It's really, there's a lot of things that have been unusual about this case. In terms of, I think some of y'all have had the experience of serving on juries before, but there have been a lot of things that have been unusual. The state also told you that this wasn't DFACS versus the Hernandez family. Well, it was for a long time until those people did their investigations and all came in to testify for the Hernandezes. Yep,
Your Honor, she's going into the DFACS case.
That's correct. She specifically said that this case was not DFACS versus the Hernandezes. She opened the door to the discussion.
You can go into what, you can open the door, not open. You can go into what the evidence was allowed in by the court, okay?
So ladies and gentlemen, the Georgia Constitution provides that y'all are the judges of the law and the facts. You are the ultimate authority in this courtroom and this courthouse. I told you at the beginning, that's why everybody, well, except for the DA's office, is standing up when y'all enter and leave the room. Because you are the ones whose opinion on the law and the facts matters. And so you might also have a disagreement with what the prosecutor and the judge consider relevant in this case. Because the only investigation that was ever done into the Hernandezes was by these individuals whose job it was to look after the best interests of the child. People who had extensive training from DFACS itself, in early childhood education, in complex trauma, in elementary education, in school counseling, in child development. All of these people who worked on this case all came in to testify for the Hernandez family. I'm not even sure if any of us can really appreciate how unprecedented that is in a case like this. Because honestly, most people, if you took their baby away and then went back to try to look for something that they had ever done wrong in their life that could be used against them, honestly, with most people, you would probably find something. But the state couldn't find a single thing on the Hernandezes. After they opened their lives to the state and every single one of its agents, after they opened their lives to that for 2 years, the state still couldn't find anything bad to say about that couple right there. That sweet couple who met up in New York and moved down to Georgia because you know what? They didn't have a ton of money. And it is a cheaper cost of living down here. And it was nice to be close to family. And building a beautiful life here in Forsyth County. And so you see how their reaction was when they experienced this accusation. They reacted exactly as normal, healthy, concerned parents would. All they cared about was making sure that their girls got the care and attention and love that they needed. That was what they were worried about. They spoke to every single person who asked them. They got dragged out of the room in the middle of the night, oh, this is to talk about breastfeeding. Actually, no, it's to ask you a bunch of questions so we can try to prove you guilty. Even under those circumstances, they could not find one single thing to bring before you as evidence that these people were evil and wicked enough to intentionally inflict harm on their tiny, beautiful 3-month-old baby, Emma Hernandez. And so, ladies and gentlemen, you have the opportunity to imagine when you hear the judge's charge and hear its requirement that in order for the state to prove the guilt of these people beyond a reasonable doubt, that they must exclude all reasonable theories of innocence. That's going to be up to you to decide. But what I put to you is that they haven't even come close. They haven't even provided a reasonable theory of what they are accusing these people of doing. At no point has anyone come to you and been able to say, I think this happened. I think this happened on this date. Here's how it happened. Here's the evidence that shows why it happened. All they've got are the x-rays. And it's funny because even in the state's opening to their closing argument, it's like they realized how much they messed up about the bruises. They realized how much they messed up because these doctors that were seeing Emma in July somehow got information that she was still in the custody of, or that her parents still had access to her, when that wasn't the case. Loving family members had taken Emma and Arya into their home because nobody was there to make excuses for a family member. You know, anybody hears these accusations, they're immediately going to have the same reaction, certainly that I had when I looked at the reports in this case. What I think y'all had when you first heard the testimony of the doctors and the accusations, which is, oh my gosh, how could anyone even think about hurting a tiny, helpless child? But they opened their lives. They made every piece of information available to the state, to DFACS, to CHOA, to law enforcement, over and over and over again. Their family members did that too. And so that's why the state has just abandoned this bruising idea. Their only evidence of it was what the parents had brought to them themselves. Because they, like any normal parents, wanted to figure out what was going on with their daughter Emma. She had had more health problems than Arya. And that's not surprising, because what we've learned, again, looking at these medical records, not that of a healthy child, we have learned what was probably going on with Emma. And that was, number one, that she had a vitamin D deficiency. She was exclusively breastfed. Her mom was anemic during pregnancy. It was a little bit of an older pregnancy. She was taking a prenatal vitamin that apparently didn't have enough vitamin D in it. And so Emma, when she was 11 weeks old, had a vitamin D level that was well below what is considered adequate by CHOA's own records. And that's where, you know, the judge will tell you that if you can resolve a case with that, while believing that everyone is telling the truth, that you should. But in this case, we know that somebody's not. And sadly, we've got to point the finger at people like Dr. Stephen Messner. And you can see that from the very beginning of his testimony. When I asked him about Emma's genetic abnormalities. And do you remember I kind of laughed? Like, oh, this is funny, you know, oh, look at this defense lawyer trying to find some excuse to, excuse for these child abuser clients of hers. Because that's what he thinks. That's his approach. And if that's how he's willing to treat lawyers in court, just imagine how he's treating parents that he has designated as child abusers and that everybody else is listening to his judgment of them. Just imagine the experience that these people had trying to take their child to doctors to figure out what was going on and having every single person treat them like dirt because people from DFACS, people that the state didn't bring before you, were in those appointments saying, yeah, they abused their baby. There's no point in us being here. They're just looking for excuses so that they can get out of trouble for abusing their baby. And so that's why I'm in the position of having to say, I don't think Dr. Messner was being honest with y'all. Because when he laughed about Emma's genetic testing that his friend Dr. Wilcox did over at Emory, he told you none of her variants were pathogenic. Ladies and gentlemen, that is false. And as the person who was most responsible for this diagnosis of non-accidental trauma on Emma Hernandez, that's a big deal. It means you shouldn't trust him when he says that her labs were within normal limits, because of course they weren't. And then when we ask him about it on the stand, oh, well, here's a reason why that doesn't matter. Well, why didn't you just say that from the beginning? You know, that she had an abnormal lab, but I looked at it and I decided not to be concerned for XYZ reason. That's what a real doctor would do. That's what a doctor who was following his oath and who cared about the safety and health of Emma Hernandez would have done. But what did Dr. Messner tell you? That he was never involved in Emma's case again after the diagnosis that he made on June 7th. He wasn't involved when she came back on June 23rd to have another skeletal survey and to receive a pelvic exam from another child abuse pediatrician. He wasn't involved when she came back at the beginning of July and was ripped away from her loving aunt and uncle because they were then accused of child abuse, because they were honest about the same manifestations of health concerns that had come up. And he wasn't involved when she was brought back yet again at the end of July for further treatment. He wasn't involved when she was brought back in August. He wasn't involved when she was brought back in December. Did he care about Emma Hernandez? Ladies and gentlemen, I think the evidence is clear. He does not. That for all of these multidisciplinary child abuse conferences that these doctors at CHOA are apparently participating in, not making any notes or recalling anything specific that might help the people who are supposed to be investigating what happened. No, they can't remember any of that. It's just rely on that diagnosis. He said it, ladies and gentlemen. He said it on June 7th, and so everybody else just needs to shut up and get in line. And that's what's been going on for the past 2 years, and it's been unimaginably hard for these people. You heard about the separation that they have endured, not only from their children, but from each other. 9 months where they couldn't even talk to each other or live in the same home. But you know what? They did it. They did it. They followed every order. They followed every rule. They followed every instruction. They took every visitation opportunity. They continued to do everything they could to be good parents under these circumstances because they had faith that the truth would finally come out. And that's what y'all are here for. So when Dr. Messner laughed about those genetic abnormalities, you have been able to see the evidence of what was actually going on, which is that Emma Hernandez had 2 genetic variants on her COL12A1 gene, which is a gene that produces collagen. And we got to talk to Dr. Lynham about it just this morning. She had to grudgingly admit that yes, bones are made up of a net of collagen that then mineralization comes on top of. So it's not like you just look at one x-ray and you can say, oh, these bones are perfectly healthy. The only way they ever could have fractured in any circumstance is if someone assaulted and attacked this child with malice. No. There are so many factors that go into that. You heard from Dr. Benson, a man who has spent his life looking at bones and putting people back together after they have experienced trauma. And he told you about the number of enzymes and proteins and cells and communications and so many things that as a layperson, I'm just trying to keep up. But there's so many things that go into the way that Emma Hernandez's tiny bones were being built while she was in her mother's womb. And those things were affected by the variants she had on the COL12A1 gene. You've heard the medical evidence about that. You heard Dr. Wilcox on the stand when, again, I'm not a scientist, I'm just a lawyer who is reading all of this stuff and talking to the experts and trying to learn what's going on and saying, well, if she has two variants, one from each parent, so you wouldn't see the same thing in the parents, but two of them together could have an impact. And well, we have this study that shows when you knock out the collagen 12 gene in mice, it makes their bones thin and brittle. And oh wait, she's got another variant on SLC34A1, which is a sodium phosphate cotransporter, and that's right, phosphate and phosphorus are critical parts of bone mineralization. And Dr. Wilcox shouted, "Prove it!" at me. I mean, I'm not a 30-year geneticist like he is, but I will say, he's the one who needs to prove it. The state is the one who needs to prove it, because they need to be able to exclude all reasonable theories of innocence. And just those genetic results alone are a reasonable theory of innocence based on what we have all learned about the way bones are built and created. Add that vitamin D deficiency on top, and that's why you have somebody with Dr. Benson's experience coming in pro bono to analyze this case and tell you, of course, this is a situation where the strongest compressive force of the uterine contractions, because remember what we learned, she was induced. She was given the medication that forces contractions. And so that's the compressive force that her bones underwent. And maybe if she hadn't had those genetic variants, if she hadn't had that vitamin D deficiency, you wouldn't have seen the tiny little rib fractures. Maybe the fact that obviously anything that happened to her leg probably was not birth related, because there are some different signs in the way things heal that you heard from Dr. Hutchison, that these classic metaphyseal lesions, that's something that can happen later in a very minor way. So that might not be birth related. That might have come from sitting in a car seat wrong. That might have come from someone normally changing a diaper. It might have come from a whole host of things when a child has more fragile bones because of her genetic makeup and because of her specific vitamin D deficiency and because of her gut absorption issues. Because that's another thing, ladies and gentlemen, that, to hear these doctors sit up there and say, well, she never broke again. She never had any of these marks again. Nothing was ever wrong with her again. As soon as we took her away from her loving family and stopped her from getting breastfed by her mother and loved on by her family every day, she was fine. That is another lie, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a particularly ugly one when you heard what you heard about Emma Hernandez's actual condition. You heard from the daycare provider, the director of the daycare, that this was absolutely not normal. Emma was coming with discoloration on a regular basis. She was having vomiting on a regular basis. They were deeply worried about her. You heard from foster parents who had the same experience. You heard from foster parents who were taking her to the doctor over and over and over again. You heard from all of these people who verified that Emma Hernandez absolutely had ongoing health concerns. But you know who you didn't hear it from? The CHOA doctors who absolutely should have known. They should have made it their responsibility. On any of those 24 multidisciplinary conferences on child abuse where they were discussing 5 to 6 children each month, you know what? This is my ask, and it might be crazy, but just throw Emma Hernandez on one of those. Just talk about her once. Maybe go talk to Dr. And I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, Milwaukee, and Dr. Olszewski. Go talk to the actual orthopedist. Go talk to the folks in the nutrition department that you consulted. Go talk to the folks in the dermatology department. Go talk to the GI folks. Go talk to the bleeding folks. Because you did see multiple clotting studies have to be done. You did hear evidence that she had unusual bleeding because what happened in the presence of the licensed credentialed supervisors, they had never seen a child have a tiny nick that wouldn't stop bleeding for 30 minutes and had to go to urgent care. The evidence is crystal clear. Emma Hernandez had ongoing health concerns. That is what brought her parents to bring her to the pediatrician after they had continued to bring her whole life for her well baby visits, her vaccinations, which, you know, it's kind of a side issue, but they gave her that whole round of vaccinations again, you know, barely 4 weeks later at CHOA, you know, which is probably not great for a baby to get Hep B and all of that stuff all over again just because your system doesn't pull it up. Because that was weird how often we heard from the doctors, like, what shows in the medical records isn't the truth. Dr. Wilcox says, oh, abnormal genetic testing, I just have to put that in there for the billing. Dr. Chanduri says abnormal weight loss, oh, just gotta put that in there for the billing. It honestly kind of reminds me of what you heard from the state in their beginning closing argument, where they said, it's just legalese, and means or means and. No. Ladies and gentlemen, these are incredibly serious charges. In my view, they're more serious than murder charges. Because an adult, you know, people can get in fights. But there is absolutely nothing that would ever in a million years justify anyone doing anything even remotely like what is alleged to have been done to Emma Hernandez by one or both of her parents. There's absolutely nothing that would ever justify it. And it wasn't done. Nobody committed these horrible assaults that the state alleges happened. And we know that because nobody was willing to come and swear that they had investigated and knew that it had. So, you'll get to hear from Mr. Wasley, who will be speaking about things from the perspective of Mrs. Hernandez. And you'll get to hear more about some of the details on those lab reports. But I saw you taking notes. You guys have all this information yourself. You know what's going on in this case. And that is that when the state says things like highly specific for child abuse, but then when we ask their witnesses about it on the stand, they can't actually say what that means. Or when I dare to ask one of their experts about a paper that she wrote herself about fractures in child abuse, that's too aggressive. I'm sorry, but you are accusing these people of being evil monsters. So maybe it would be okay to let them defend themselves. Maybe it would be okay to let them ask the questions that any normal, healthy parent would do if they were actively concerned about the health of their child. So, the very first day of jury selection, May 12th, Governor Kemp signed a new law here in Georgia. It's called Bridges Law.
Objection, Your Honor.
And it requires defect.
Objection.
You can only argue the evidence, ma'am. If it's not in evidence, you cannot argue it to the jury.
Your Honor, I would argue Georgia law is in evidence.
Ma'am, if it's applicable to this case, meaning it was mentioned or gone into during the trial of the case, not just that there's been some passage of a law. Court prohibits you from going into that.
And this is why, again, I refer you to the Georgia Constitution of why you are the judges of the law and the facts. Because it's easy when you have a judge prosecutor that have been working together for a long time in the same courtroom. It's easy to just assume that everybody who comes through these doors with an indictment is guilty. They must be a monster. This indictment was made against them. But that's why it's so critical for someone to do an investigation, ladies and gentlemen. And an investigation was done. A 2-year investigation was done. And everyone who participated in the observations of Matthew and Tucky Hernandez and their children came here to testify on behalf of Matthew and Tucky Hernandez. Again, you may disagree with some of the rulings about what was relevant. You may have wanted to hear more. But if there is ever a question in your mind at any point during the deliberation, that's a doubt, and you have to resolve it against the state. So you'll hear more in the jury charge about things like grave suspicion. Nobody can be convicted just because of a grave suspicion. You hear about excluding all reasonable theories of innocence. And what you would have to think happened here to agree with the state is that for 2 years, these people have somehow fooled every experienced CASA, daycare worker, DFACS investigator, foster parent, law enforcement officer, friend, family member, community member. All of those people who were given full access to everything about their lives, all of those people were somehow fooled and taken in. And only the prosecutor, who has thousands of other cases and constantly wants to argue that things aren't relevant, even when they have to do with the warrant for the arrest in this case, that they are somehow the only ones that got it right. But ladies and gentlemen, I think you know better than that. I think you know in your hearts what's the right thing to do, and I ask you to do it. When you go back to the jury room, you'll elect a foreperson, you'll look at the evidence, you'll go back over your notes, you'll think about these 2 weeks, and you'll think about, as the conscience of Forsyth County, which you are, I'm not even getting into the technical stuff, like venue. Of course the state hasn't proved that this happened in Forsyth County because they don't even know what happened.
Objection.
They don't even have that.
Objection. It wasn't evidence.
You have argument. You may finish.
Maybe she can tell you in her second closing, when she gets the last word, where that evidence was of the it that they keep referring to. So keep your ears open for that, for sure. But all those technicalities, fundamentally, they don't always matter when it comes to a tiny child like Emma Hernandez. What matters is child safety. What matters is the best interest of this innocent child. And I put before you that the people who victimized her are not her parents, who love her and want nothing more than to continue being reunited with her and to help her grow and develop and play music and sing and go on camping trips and do all of the normal thing and go to bookstores and play with toys and play games and eat healthy food and learn about your cultures from your mom and your dad. They're amazing parents. They're wonderful parents. Emma Hernandez is incredibly lucky to have Matt and Tucky Hernandez as her parents, because other people might have folded under what happened for the past 2 years. But they didn't. They are here standing strong, coming before you to make themselves available for whatever the state has to throw at them. And ladies and gentlemen, you've seen everything the state has to throw at them. A couple of lying doctors who can't even be bothered to follow her case throughout her multiple visits to the hospital. It's disappointing. It's shameful. But what it is that these people are not guilty of any of these charges against them. And I ask you to go back into that jury room and to make that decision for Emma Hernandez, for her family, and for any other family who has experienced this same nightmare of bringing their own child in for help and being turned into criminals and having their family torn apart. You have the power to fix this. You have the power to do justice, and I am begging you to do it. Thank you so much.
We know that jury service is difficult and disruptive in your lives. We believe that the truth in this case will come out through your verdict. Taki, Matt, Emma, and Aria, they've been waiting for this moment for almost 2 years. 2 years, almost 2 years. Taki and Matt are not guilty. They trusted the system. In order to have a crime, you have to have two things. You have to have mens rea, or the state of mind, and you also have to have the act itself. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, in this case, you don't have either one of those. The intent in this case is a malicious intent, which means a specific intent to cause harm. That's what's required. We haven't heard anything about maliciousness in this case. The act itself, you must have the coming together of the act and the intent to form a crime. We don't have a crime in this case. In fact, there is no evidence of motive. There's no evidence of intent in this case. The only evidence you've heard in this case is the good character of the defendants, their truthfulness, their nonviolence, their peacefulness, and their reputation. I touched upon the presumption of innocence during the jury selection and opening statement. The presumption of innocence is a real thing. The presumption of innocence is a brick wall that exists between the prosecution on one side and the defendants on the other side. The prosecution has to try and remove the bricks from that brick wall, and they have to prove the elements of these alleged crimes. There is no act, there is no malicious intent. They failed to remove the bricks. The wall of innocence still stands in this case. The burden of proof in this case rests upon the prosecution to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. You will receive jury instructions from His Honor about this. There's so much doubt in this case, so much doubt. We submit to you that the prosecution has not met its burden of proof. In my opening statement, I mentioned many things. I stated that this is a tragedy of epic proportion. You carry a child for 9 months, and suddenly and without warning, your baby is ripped away from you. I can't imagine. We understand the mandatory reporting aspect of this case. We understand that part. Many of our witnesses that we presented to you are mandatory reporters. What we don't understand in this case is the rushed diagnosis by Messner, along with the downplaying and the concealment of lab results that were far from normal. And, for that matter, the lack of a comprehensive genetic testing and follow-up labs. It's important to mention in this case that 2 of Choa's own orthopedic doctors, Dr. O and Dr. Azakabu, orthopedics, they understood the diagnosis in this case to be vitamin D deficiency. And they recommended polyvisal supplementation, and they put Emma in a soft cast. Dr. Messner, he happily inserted himself into this case. Suddenly and without warning, and before all the results are in, Dr. Messner, he acts with orgasmic hypocrisy and makes a knee-jerk diagnosis of child abuse. That's what this case is about. The Hernandez family are a loving family. They took their daughter Emma to Sunshine Pediatrics and showed her because they were concerned for Emma and wanted answers. They put their trust in the system. They provided the information to the system. Matthew Hernandez took his cell phone and showed them the picture. this whole bruising situation, it's ridiculous. How many times did bruises in this case show up in the care of other people that weren't, and when the child wasn't even in the care of the parents? Numerous times. We spent a lot of time on the acrocyanosis situation. Why? Because it's important. Anyone can say that someone else caused that bruising. The orthopedics at CHOA, they knew what was happening in this case. The language that they use in the records is unremarkable. Some of the language in the records itself. This is from Dr. Nawakabu. Skeletal survey review demonstrates irregularity. Irregularity. Not broken bones, irregularity. Of the proximal and distal femur, proximal tibia, and the first metatarsal. Concerning her healing fracture, but it's an irregularity. They weren't that concerned about it. This is from the orthopedic at CHOA. Again, from an orthopedic at CHOA. They can't recall any inciting trauma or accidents. Upon skeletal survey, irregularities of the right femur, tibia, and first metatarsal were found. Irregularities. Dr. Benson in this case told you that there are irregularities. They want it to be broken bones. We say it's irregularities. Their own doctors, in the beginning of the case, when Emma was at the emergency room, say it's irregularities. The Hernandezes are a loving family. I think I mentioned that in my opening statement. They took their daughter Emma to Sunshine Pediatrics and CHOA because they were concerned and they wanted answers. That's all. They just wanted some answers. They cooperated, even showed a picture, as I stated before. We don't want to go on and on with character witnesses in this case. I know character witnesses, it's boring. Jury duty is tough. It's boring. No one really wants to be here to do it, but we appreciate you for being here and paying attention throughout this entire case. Everyone was taking notes. Everyone was paying attention. We could see it. We could have brought in hundreds of people that can vouch for the credibility of the parents in this case. Hundreds, literally. But we wanted to be respectful of your time and make our deadline. Every character witness in this case testified that Taki and Matt are loving and caring parents of good moral character who can be trusted under oath, and their reputation is second to none. They would never hurt or harm their daughter Emma. You have been in jury duty for almost 2 weeks, but the defendants haven't had a normal family relationship for almost 2 years. 2 years. Their life was turned upside down when their 2 children were taken away from them. This trial has been an opportunity for them to tell you their story. You, ladies and gentlemen, in this case are the sole judge of credibility. We have heard some inconsistent testimony in this case, and frankly, quite baffling testimony from the prosecution witnesses in this case. And I would like to start with Dr. Messner. The evidence in this case shows that CHOA ignored the abnormal test results. I think we hammered on that enough to show you guys that something's not right here. CHOA ignored the abnormal lab results. The in-person examination and other signs and symptoms that baby Emma had been experienced were also ignored. Acrocyanosis, other issues, gut problems, vomiting, all that stuff. It came out through this trial. Dr. Messner testified that a high D-dimer does not mean anything, and that it's only attributable to trauma. This is simply not true. Dr. Messner ignored the high fibrinogen levels. Dr. Messner ignored the low lipase level and the amylase levels that strongly contradict any claim of recent trauma. Throughout the medical records, it is mentioned numerous times that Emma's lab work was reassuring. We're not sure if the records are going to go out with you yet, but that's something that we'll discuss with His Honor. Dr. Messner told another doctor who wanted to do a blood clot study that Emma's lab work was within normal limits. Within normal limits. This is it's not true. It's so far from the truth, it's not even close. You are the judge of credibility. Dr. Messner testified that he was not even involved in the second Choa visit that Emma had. This is not true. Dr. Messner frankly ignored the acrocyanosis diagnosis, and he blew it off like it does not even matter. Dr. Messner inserted himself into this case as a child abuse editor. Dr. Messner did not issue a single in-house order in this case. In fact, all of Dr. Messner's orders that he did place were either discontinued or they were canceled. Did he have even authority to treat this patient? It's not very relevant as to why we're here, but did he? I think Nurse Amber Borders, when she testified, she read all this into the record. He did send a minimal request for a genetic test looking for a limited amount of information, I believe 2 genetic variants. These genetic variants showed up in Emma, several of them as a matter of fact. 2 of them were pathogenic. More importantly, Dr. Messner ignored Choa's very own orthopedic doctors, as I already talked about. Not a single orthopedic testified for the prosecution in this case. Not a single one. We're talking about bones. We're talking about alleged fractures, but not a single orthopedic from a big hospital showed up at this trial. Not one. Not one orthopedic. That is telling. Dr. Messner ignored the vitamin D deficiency diagnosis made by his own orthopedic doctors, Dr. O and Dr. Nwakabu, who prescribed Emma with the vitamin D. Dr. Messner was wrong. He was wrong in this case. I'm not saying he's an awful person. I'm saying he's caught up in the system. Sometimes when people are caught up in the system, they become skewed, you know? Their bias and all that comes into play in these types of cases. Dr. Messner was biased. In my opening statement, I said, why? I just don't understand why. But I think during the course of this trial, we learned why. He's been in the system and he's designated a child abuse expert. He's caught up and he's biased. There are other things at play here, but they'll come out later. Dr. Chang stated a second D-dimer test was done during the July 23 visit and testified as to the result. This is another doctor, Dr. Chang from Choa. There was not even a second D-dimer test done in July of 2023. He was wrong. A D-dimer test was done at Georgia Hematology and requested by the family in 2024. Why? Because they want to know what's wrong. They love and they care about their daughter. Over a year later, and it was still high. Dr. Chang tried to downplay the vitamin D deficiency and correct the high D-dimer. He got caught. Choa's very own guidelines, their very own guidelines that I used with the last witness that also testified here today. Choa's very own guidelines show that Emma was considered deficient in vitamin D. Deficient. Also, they just blow off this acrocyanosis. You can have 2 types, normal or peripheral cyanosis, acrocyanosis. Choa downplayed all of it. I'd just like to talk about the Choa radiologist next, just for a minute. I believe it's Dr. Mahalan Ray. She testified that the fractures on the leg, on the lower limb, were acute. Acute. None of these fractures, the ribs, anywhere on Emma, how you define them, were acute. Their own records say how they're all healing, old healing fractures. She comes in and testifies, oh, these are acute in June? Not even close. Again, you're the judge of credibility in this case. Dr. Messner calls an acute fracture, quote, one that shows no signs of healing. No signs of healing. The alleged fractures are healing in Chola's own records. It's all over the records that these are healing. The alleged fractures are healing in Chola's own records. Dr. Messner and Dr. Mulholland Ray are not on the same page. They're just not on the same page. I think to myself, am I missing something? Chola's already designated these alleged lower leg fractures as old healing fractures. Something's wrong here. Dr. Mulholland Ray testifies that the ribs were at least 4 to 6 weeks old, at least. Images were taken in June of 2023, and Emma was born when she was born mid-March of 2023, and they all admit that it takes at least 90 days for the bone to remodel. 90 days. When you have a vitamin D deficiency, it takes the bone even longer to remodel than 90 days. More reasonable doubt. Their own doctor agreed that you can't date stamp these alleged fractures. You can only guesstimate. Ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you, we're not here to guesstimate. We got 2 wonderful parents on trial for felony child abuse and aggravated battery. We're not here to guesstimate. There's no guessing about it. Radiologists give impressions. Radiology is certainly not perfect. We've learned that through the course of this trial. Dr. Mulholland Ray gets into errors to try and deliberately bolster Chola's case, but she's wrong because they're not acute. It seems like one doctor trying to cover and justify another doctor's claims and their actions. Dr. Ray testified about squeezing the child just like Dr. Messner did. That's another part. The mechanism of injury in this case is not even there either. It's speculation. Pure speculation. In fact, children under 2 years of age with unexplained bruises will automatically get labeled as child abuse if you take your child to Choa. It can happen to you. It can happen to your grandchildren.
Objection.
Dr. Benson is an orthopedic surgeon, board certified by the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons since 1980. He didn't come in here because he was paid. He wants to help, like the hundreds of other people out here who also want to help. He's been in private practice as a general orthopedic surgeon and a spine surgery until December of 2000. Again, this case is not about money for Dr. Benson. And again, it's telling in this case how the only orthopedic is him. No bone doctors, no law enforcement. Because their own orthopedic doctors, based on the records, were only concerned about a vitamin D deficiency and prescribed polyvisol to baby Emma and diagnosed Emma with vitamin D deficiency. That was the final diagnosis in this case. It's on page 2 of the records. Page 2. It's the final diagnosis. That's it right there. Page 2. There is no diagnosis for child abuse, ladies and gentlemen. The diagnosis is a closed fracture. There is no diagnosis for child abuse. The final diagnosis, closed fracture and vitamin D deficiency unspecified. That's the final diagnosis in this case. That's why we're here. That's why 2 people have been charged with felony criminal charges in this case. Shame on them. They should have done more. Dr. Benson has studied the histology of various deficiencies. He's inherited metabolic bone disorders and all these fancy words that I can't even pronounce. Dr. Benson has treated children with genetic bone-related problems, developmental failures, as well as bone infections and occasional tumors of the bone. He's highly qualified. He's a surgeon. He sees things from the inside out, not from the outside in. Dr. Benson recognizes the effects of malnutrition on various deficiencies and their effect on the developing bones of children. CHOA does not. There are more than 100 known conditions which impair normal bone strength. More than 100. You heard Dr. Benson testify that vitamin D deficiency can also start in utero or after birth. Their witness said, no, there's no way. Vitamin D deficiency can't start in utero. That's not possible. Dr. Benson testified about the demineralization of her teeth, and so did some other witnesses in this case, Tony Schultz, and some other of the character and fat witnesses. I didn't even know they were going to say it. It came out naturally that her teeth are coming in crooked, they're demineralized. That was the people that were taking care of them, that cared about her enough and realized that something was just not right. Something was not right with her, and that she was still experiencing health issues. There have been plenty of infants still hospitalized from birth who were discovered to have fractures while still in the hospital. Dr. Messner is significant to me. Dr. Messner in this case, he testified and looked me in the eye and said, he ruled out everything in this case. It's not that he ruled out everything in this case, he ignored everything else in this case. He ignored it. I believe Dr. Benson talked about the squeeze and how much pounds of pressure. I think he talked about 15,000 to 20,000 pounds of pressure that it would take to cause something like this. And that childbirth, something that being a man I never want to have to go through, and certainly feel that, 15,000 to 20,000 pounds of pressure. They try to make up excuses. Another excuse is this whole clavicle situation. Where's the pressure coming from? Is pressure coming from the inside, or is it coming when the clavicle is almost out of the delivery canal? The pressure's on the inside. Taki was in labor for 12 hours. They just blow her off and say, well, she had no complications. Being in labor for 12 hours is not a complication? Again, Emma had gut problems. She had problems vomiting. She had infections. She had diarrhea. She had problems that were continuing. All the witnesses that had direct knowledge of this testified in this case as to those things that were going on. We get into the hormone, we get into the acrocyanosis, calcium and phosphorus and all that other stuff. There's other lab results that weren't right. It wasn't just about D-dimer, it wasn't about fibrinogen, it was about many other lab results that just weren't normal. The acrocyanosis was misunderstood. Was it really misunderstood, or was it just ignored? It can be confused with bruising, but it's not bruising. This condition continued to mysteriously exist, and it was written off by CHOA even when Emma was out of the care of Matt and Taki. You heard, I think it was interesting how one of the foster parents came in, nice guy, testified that, hey, when we gave her a bath, we took her out of the bath and we noticed these weird marks and discolorations that appeared on her. But for CHOA, it doesn't matter. Don't take her to CHOA. Don't take her to CHOA. It appeared on the foot and legs with Tony and Tuck. It appeared on Emma with one of the foster parents, as I talked about, in the bath. It appeared a lot in the presence of daycare employees and the director who reported it. It appeared with the baby, with another foster parent, Tran Wen. They all reported it. Nothing was done. Nobody thought to pick up the phone from DFATS and give Cho a call and say, hey, we got a problem here. The problem is they made the diagnosis too quick. That's the problem here. And once they made their diagnosis, they had to stick with it. They didn't want to go back on it. They can't be wrong. It's Choa. All the evidence presented in this case about the cooperation and how the parents cared about the condition of their daughter came from the parents. Came from the parents. They try to go through their head as a parent, your child gets taken away. What's the first thing you're going to start asking yourself? How did this happen? How did this happen? Where did it happen? What did I do? As a parent, as a grandparent, you start questioning yourself. It's normal. That's a normal thing. Allegations of child abuse were made and the children were removed. Mom was arrested. Several months later, Dad was arrested. Several months later. I'm not going to spend much more time on the labs. We all know that the labs were off and the labs weren't normal. They weren't reassuring. They stated so many times in those records that they do go out, well, you can look through it, it'll be in there, by the trauma department, reassuring. Labs are within normal limits. Another doctor wants to do a blood clotting test, and Dr. Messner tells him, don't worry about it, the labs are within normal limits. It's in the records too, page 527. 527, within normal limits. This is it right here. I'm getting old, but my memory's still not too bad. 527. Per Dr. Messner from last visit, all clotting studies returned within normal limits. This is later down the road. Later down the road in July. Why? Because he couldn't change his mind. He doesn't want to change his mind. I'm sure ego plays a role in this as well, just like anything else. I'm sorry, but it's a mistake. You made a mistake, Dr. Messner. You had a chance to make this right before this trial even started. It didn't happen. A very low lipase level and low amylase level confirmed that Emma was not subject to any trauma at the time of her presentation for days prior. I'm not going to get in and recap all the witnesses. I wrote a lot down here, but my time is limited. And you know, during the course of this trial, my time has certainly been limited. All the questions were taken away before I even had a chance to get up. They didn't rule out other causes. They just didn't. Dr. Hutchinson testified. Dr. Hutchinson states no known trauma, no blood in the head or behind the eye, which would be indicative of trauma. Abnormal labs, vitamin D deficient equals high risk for fractures. Cannot date the fractures, talks about the metaphyseal lesions, last skeletal survey, everything is normal. Mechanisms have to be considered